Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I'm Linda Barrett with the Fort Worth Public Library. And while we're waiting for everybody to get logged in and join us, I am going to go over some upcoming author events we have. On Thursday, March the 18th at 6:30, author Connor Bender will discuss his spy novel set during World War II. Then on Thursday, okay, I've got one of these dates wrong. It should be the 25th. Kaya McLaren will discuss her novel about a breast cancer survivor trying to figure out what is next in life. And then on Wednesday, March the 31st at 6:30, Frank Andre Guriti will discuss his nonfiction book on how Texas sports in the 1960s and 1970s influenced sports across the country. So I do have a little bit of housekeeping here. If you have questions as Mr. Lopresti is speaking, just go ahead and you can enter those into the chat or the Q&A, and we will get to those after his presentation. He will go through and answer those questions. So I am going to turn things over now to Gabby Keenitz.
Hello, and my name is Gabby. I'm a librarian in the Genealogy, Local History and Archives Unit, and it is my pleasure to introduce Robert Lopresti, who is our author for today. He wrote a book called When Women Didn't Count, and we're very lucky to have him during this month of Women's History Month. He's going to feature a PowerPoint about his book and selections from various sections of his book, of which there are 2 copies currently available and circulating in the Fort Worth Public Library system. Robert Lopresti, he lives in the Pacific Northwest. He was a government information librarian for 41 years, most of them at Western Washington University. His book, When Women Didn't Count, won the Lane Saunders Memorial Research Award from the American Library Association. He is also an award-winning mystery writer with more than 70 published short stories. His most recent novel, Greenfellas, is about the mafia trying to save the environment. And now I will pass it off on to Robert Lopresti and let him begin his presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Gabby and Linda and the Fort Worth Library System. It's an honor to be here, and I hope we'll have a good time today for the next hour. I look forward to your questions, which I know you're going to put in the chat. And I am going to attempt to say, I want to say greetings from Bellingham, Washington, the city of subdued excitement. That's our unofficial nickname. And I'm going to try and share the screen, and hopefully we'll be able to do this presentation. There we go. And okay, everybody seeing what I'm seeing, I hope? Okay, so subject is When Women Didn't Count, and we're talking about this book, The Chronic Mismeasure and Marginalization of American Women in Federal Statistics, which was published by Prager Press in 2017. And this is a book about how federal government statistics, and by the way, whenever I say government in the next hour, unless I say otherwise, I'm talking about the US federal government, not Canada, not Texas, but the US federal government. How women have been erased and mislocated in government statistics from 1790 on to the present day. So let's take it from there. Obviously, the best way to start a discussion of government statistics is with a quiz. That seems obvious to me. And by the way, all the pictures you see here, with 1 or 2 exceptions near the end, are from government publications. And if we were doing this in person, we would have have contestants and there would be prizes, but I can't do that here. But you are welcome to keep track of how many questions you get right, and you might want to put that down in the chat and see how you compare to your fellow viewers. There are going to be 8 questions. So question number 1. When did the Supreme Court decree that civil differences between the sexes had come, quote, almost, if not quite, to the vanishing point? By the way, if you had memorized my book, you'd have all the answers to these in your head. Okay. Was it 1923, 1953, or 1973? Write down your answer if you want to. The answer is 1923. The Supreme Court had ruled that minimum wage laws were unconstitutional for men. But the question was whether there could be minimum wage laws for women and for children. And in 1923, the Supreme Court said that because the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote, the different civil differences between men and women had essentially come to the vanishing point. And therefore, it was also illegal for minimum wage laws to protect women, just as it was to protect men. Obviously, they changed their viewpoint on this, or we wouldn't be having discussion on minimum wage laws today. Number 2, according to the 1930 Index of Occupations, which was published by the Census Bureau, which of these jobs was not considered peculiar or unusual for women? Butchers, sheriff, or stonemason? Choose your answer. The answer is sheriffs. The others were considered, it was considered quite normal for women to be butchers or stonemasons, according to the census there. By the way, there is an entire book called The Secret Life of the Lawman's Wife, which is not a government publication, about women sheriffs and police chiefs in United States history, going back much further than you'd think. Very often they were the widows or wives of people who had previously been sheriffs or police chiefs. But it's a fascinating book. What was the name of the radio program the Bureau of Labor Statistics created during World War II? And I should point out that, remember, during World War II, radio was the form of mass communication that got into people's homes. There was no television or Netflix or internet. And the name of the show that the Bureau of Labor Statistics created was either Housewife versus Hitler, Housewife versus Hunger, or Housewife versus Economist. Got your answer? It was Housewife versus Economist. It featured A. Ford Hinrichs, who was the acting director of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, discussing with his wife the cost of living. I have no idea whether it was really his wife or an actress, but she would say that she thought the cost of living was going up at this level, and he said, no, our statistics prove it's only going up at this level. And he would, during the course of the show, slowly convince her that his statistics were more accurate than her, say, intuition. This was actually propaganda, because raises during World War II could only, people could only get raises based on the cost of living. And the unions complained that the Bureau of Labor Statistics figures were way too low. And they attempted to prove this by surveying housewives about the costs. And so this was an argument that no, the BLS was much more accurate than housewives. Question number 4. If a person wrote on a 1990 census form that they were the spouse of someone of the same sex, how did it appear in the reports? Either the relationship was changed unmarried partner, or the relationship was left blank, or their sex was changed. Okay, the answer is their sex was changed. This is from the official census page on the subject. So if you were a man and you said that you were married to another man, what they actually did was change the sex of your partner on the form, which is certainly the cheapest sex change operation in history. Number 5, what did the National Institute of Mental Health do with the first decade of data they collected on family violence? Either they accidentally erased it, or they copyrighted it so no one else could use it, or they did nothing. You take your choice. Answer is they did nothing. And we know that because this conference that was held in 1978 featured Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski. I should say this, if you didn't read it, the topic was issues in federal statistical needs relating to women. And Congresswoman Barbara Mikulski, who retired as a senator a few years ago, explained that when she held the first ever hearings on family violence, which we would now call domestic violence, the the agency, the National Institute of Mental Health, said, we've been studying that for 10 years and it's an epidemic. And she says, well, can you tell me how many women have been killed? No. Can you tell me how many have been battered? No. She said, well, what have you done with the data? Nothing. We haven't done anything with it. And she said something which I absolutely love. She said, this is not a butterfly collection. You can't collect these statistics just for your own entertainment. You actually are paying, the taxpayers are paying for them, and you have to make them available. So I wrote an article about my book called Not a Butterfly Collection. Number 6, which government agency was created because a, quote, stunning group of girls, meaning very attractive group of young women, lobbied Congress? Was it the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Census Bureau, or the National Center for Health Statistics? And the answer is the Census Bureau, which happened in 1906. This is according to a statistician who was there at the time. Now, some of you may say, wait, the census has been around since 1790. And you're right, of course. But for many years, over a century, what would happen was they would create a census office a year or two before the census was supposed to happen, and it would close down after the last report. And statisticians had been asking for decades that there be a permanent agency who could collect statistics all year, all the decade around. But that didn't happen until 1906, when the head of the census office hired a group of attractive young women and told them if they wanted to keep their jobs, they had to lobby Congress. And they succeeded. This according to a statistician who was there at the time. Question number 7. During World War II, what were the women in the Marines called? There's always someone who thinks this is a trick question and there weren't any women in the Marines, but there were. And you'll notice that originally the women in the Army were called the WACs, the Women Army Auxiliary Corps. They weren't actually part of the Army. Then when they became part of the Army, they lost an A and just became the Women's Army Corps. Women in the Navy were called WAVES. Women in the Coast Guard were called SPARs. Well, what were women in the Marines called? Either Marinettes, Glamourines, or Marines. And the answer is they were called Marines. Marinettes was what women who were secretaries in the Marines during World War I were sometimes called. Glamourines was a name that was suggested and rejected. Thomas Holcomb was the commandant of the entire Marine Corps, and he did not want women in the Marines, but he had to do it because of personnel needs. And people said, well, what is their nickname going to be? And he said, they don't have a nickname. They don't need a nickname. They're Marines. And that made him very popular with the women in the Marine Corps. Question number 8. This is the last question. In 2011, when Senator John Kyle learned that his statistics about Planned Parenthood and abortion were wrong, what did he do? Here's what he said originally. If you want an abortion, you go to Planned Parenthood, and that's well over 90% of what Planned Parenthood does. It was immediately pointed out to him that the actual figure is about 3% of what Planned Parenthood does. And then what did he do after he found out he was wrong? Either he apologized, or he changed the official transcript, or he denied saying it. And the answer is, he changed the official transcript. Members of Congress are allowed to change the congressional record before it's published so that it reflects what they wish they had said rather than what they actually said. So the official congressional record says that he said, if you want an abortion, you go to Planned Parenthood, and that is what Planned Parenthood does. Okay. Now you can add up your scores and see how well you did. Perfect score would be 8. Now, why did I give you a quiz? Well, 2 reasons. One is the first thing a government information librarian learns, if they're any good at their job, is they have to keep people awake. So hopefully that was one thing that was achieved by this. Another is this gives you a sample of the contents, because I'm not going to be able to discuss every chapter or every section of the book. Okay, so how did this book get started? This is, by the way, this picture I always like to point out, that's the official housewives uniform from 1918. And the color, by the way, is an artifact of the printing. It was actually a black and white picture. The reason you have an official housewives uniform, it's actually a uniform for official housewives, because during World War I, they had shortages of food, and they actually, government paid women to go around the country and teach other housewives how to use food more efficiently. And that was the uniform they were supposed to wear. I have no idea whether anyone actually did wear those. Okay, so how did the book get started? As a government information librarian, I have learned that when I answer statistical questions for people, it's always a good idea to look at the introduction to the book, because that's where the interesting stuff is. That's where this, they say this didn't work, and this isn't what we hoped, and this is the mistakes. So I always go to the introduction. And one time I was helping somebody with the occupation volume of the 1920 Census of Population. And I came across this fascinating paragraph in the introduction. Oh, you can't, I don't know if you can read the top line. I can't. It says, unusual occupations for women. And it explains that the census takers, which they were called enumerators, as in previous censuses, recorded women in occupations which would be very unusual for women. And so they said, whenever we could figure out what the mistake was, we corrected it. So my feeling with 100 years of hindsight is there are a whole lot of women who were pioneers in their field who were simply erased out of history, out of the census forms, because somebody didn't believe that they could have actually been doing those jobs. And so you have carpenters and machinists and plasterers and engineers and telephone linemen who are listed as having been women because they couldn't figure out what the mistake was. Maybe it was a mistake, maybe it wasn't, but we know that they didn't bother to check any of the men who said they had those professions. And they said there were fewer women in these skilled trades in 1920 than in 1910 because they were much more rigid about checking for mistakes. So this is a word cloud. I don't know if you're familiar with them. I took the entire text of the book and put it into a word cloud app. And the larger the word is and the darker the word is, the more often it appears in my book. When I tried this the first time, the app actually said that the word that came out the most in my book was men, and I almost had a coronary about that. But it turned out the app was actually finding the word men in the word women. So I threw that app out and used a different one. But this gives you some idea of what words appeared the most often in my book. So which government agencies did I get information from? Well, you'd expect the Census Bureau, but there were plenty of others. And there are 13 or 14, depending on how you count, federal agencies whose main job is to collect government statistics. And over 100 that do collect government statistics. So this are a few of the ones that I use the most often. This is not the chapters of the book, but these are the sections that the chapters are made up of. Made up of? Yeah. Okay. So, for example, the demographics section has chapters on population and age, marriage and divorce, motherhood, single mothers. Women at Home has chapters on housewives versus homemakers versus housekeepers. Those are all different terms according to the government. And also a chapter on head of household, head of family, which is a concept the government used for many years. The concept of employment includes a chapter on occupations suitable for women, which was an interesting concept. Also a chapter on gainful employment, which was a term that hid the number of women working for decades. Income and unemployment. The section on women at work has chapters on employment and factory workers, farm workers, women business owners. Women in Health has chapters on contraception, abortion, and non-reproductive health issues. Women in the Law has women as criminals, women as prostitutes, women as victims of crime, and a chapter on rape. And Women at War has chapters about women in the military and also Rosie the Riveter, women working in the 2 world wars. And today we're going to be discussing a chapter from the section on women at work, specifically farm females. That is the name of the chapter. I gave it that name because it is the term used in the 1990s by the Census Bureau for women who were working on farms, living on farms, or consider themselves to be farmers. The earliest figures we have on women on farm life was from the Commissioner of Agriculture report 1871. And he has a section in there on the the education of women in the United States, which the Commissioner of Agriculture was not too enthusiastic about. There we go. He said that to learn to pen gracefully a note of invitation, to sing a few staves of music, to finger mechanically piano keys, to dance, and to simper affectedly are chief accomplishments to which even the beginnings of solid culture are subordinate. So according to this government official, what your great-great-grandparents were learning, great-great-grandmothers were learning to do in 1871 was essentially to simper affectedly. I don't know how accurate that is, but that's what was being said in government publications. Let's see. He also went on to have several pages of anecdotes about how women were involved with agriculture in the United States. This is still 1871. And here are a few of my favorite examples. In Missouri, 1 woman in a garden or at the sorghum kettle is considered equal to 2 men. In Maine, outdoor work by women, farm work by women is unknown. It's incompatible with New England institutions. You always have to ask how true any of these things are. But most Negro women in the South declined farm labor as a relic of slavery, not suited for ladies. Women who manage farms, usually widows of male farmers, succeed at about the same rate as men, but his theory was that that's because those who are less confident of doing the job sell out the farms. The day has passed in progressive Nebraska for the weaker vessel to get less pay than men for the same work. And I believe finally, yes, a crusty bachelor maliciously hints that the agricultural occupation preferred by women in his section is raising cane. So, again, this is what appeared in an official government report, 1871. 1908, Teddy Roosevelt, as president, came up with the, by the way, I should make it clear, and I didn't, that I'm not giving you everything that's in these chapters. I'm only picking highlights. There's more stuff. 1908, President Roosevelt created the Country Life Commission. They were very concerned about the fact that people were leaving the farms, moving to the cities. And they realized that farmers' daughters were leaving at a more rapid rate than farmers' sons. And so they wanted to know why this was happening, and they created the Country Life Commission, which was to hold hearings for farmers and farmers' wives to try to find out why this was happening. And one of the people who was very interested in this subject was Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She was an author mainly of fiction. She wrote a short story called The Yellow Wallpaper, which you can easily find on the web. You can also find video versions of it on YouTube. It's a very short story, and it is considered a proto-feminist piece of fiction. And it's highly readable today, in my opinion. And she wrote an article about the Country Life Commission for one of the major magazines, and she said, why are there no women on the commission? If they're so concerned about women leaving the farms, why aren't there any women on the commission? And she had her own theories as to why women were leaving, and here's what she said. There is no sweatshop that fails to pay something to its hard-driven slaves, but the sweatshop called the kitchen gives no wages. Okay. 1911, the commission issued its report, and part of what they said was, whatever general hardships, such as poverty, isolation, lack of labor-saving devices, may exist on any given farm, the burden of these hardships falls more heavily on the farmer's wife than on the farmer himself. 1910 census. And by the way, that woman there is working on the 1910 census. She is using what is known as a Hollerith machine. Mr. Hollerith was a man interested in automating the census to make it work more quickly and more efficiently. And he was familiar with the jacquard looms used by the mill workers in New England making fabric. And the jacquard looms used a card with holes in it that allowed them to tell quickly where the fabric was supposed to go. And he realized that if you took a card, a long card, the size of a dollar bill was the idea, and punched holes in particular areas, that you could put the data in there, which would be much more efficient than handwriting it or typing it, and could be compiled in many different ways. Some of you are undoubtedly old enough to remember when bills used to come in the mail that were on long cards with holes punched in them. They were still called Hollerith cards. But anyway, we have the 1910 census. And to everyone's shock, the number of women involved in agricultural work increased by 85% over 1900. In fact, at a time when people living on farms decreased, 1 in 4 farm workers, 25%, was a woman. And frankly, nobody believed that. And they had an explanation for why these figures were so out of whack. And that was that the instructions for the census takers, the enumerators as they were called, had changed. In the 1910 census, the instructions said, you cannot assume because a person is a woman or a child that they don't have a job. You actually have to ask every woman and every child whether they have a job, which had never been done before. And suddenly, whoo, there were a whole lot more women working in general, but especially in agriculture. In some parts of the country, it was 300% increase over 1900. Well, they decided that couldn't possibly be right. So in 1920, they changed the instructions again, and the number plummeted. And they said, well, see, 1910 was simply a mistake. Now, statisticians 100 years later tend to say 1910 was probably the only one that was accurate. But that's what we know. 1912, George K. Holmes wrote a report on the wages of farm labor. What were people who worked on farms or worked for farmers were getting paid. And for the first 70 pages of that report, it was pretty dry, uninteresting statistics. And then the last 2 pages, things took a deep left turn here. Insanity of farm women, a persistent calumny without the least foundation. For many years, the published statement has been current that farm life has made the women of the farm especially prone to insanity. It has been represented that the solitude of life, drudgery, want of variety, and whatnot have created a greater percentage of insanity among farm women than among the women of any other life or occupation. He actually blamed it on one particular woman who wrote on the subject, but who that woman was, he did not identify. For a while, I thought it was Charlotte Perkins Gilman, but I don't think that's right. Unfortunately, I can't tell you because I don't know. He actually bothered to contact the superintendent of an insane asylum in Iowa and said, is it true that farm women go crazy at a higher rate than farm men? And the man replied with something that was really interesting. He said, no, men are more likely to be institutionalized than women for being insane, but that may be because insane women can be more controlled. In other words, it would be easier for a man to keep his insane wife locked up, perhaps chained to a wall, I don't know, than for a woman to do the same thing with her insane husband. So now you have this wonderful image of women on farms in Iowa being locked up in their own houses. So, interesting thought. By the way, Mr. Holmes, the year before this, had written a report in which he claimed that farm women were no longer doing any work at all. They were just spending all their time at the Grange and the church and so on. So, interesting fella. 1913, the Agriculture Secretary sent letters to the housewives of 55,000 farmers. He wanted to know what their opinion was about how their life on the farms were. And they complained about bad roads, expensive telephones, lack of social organizations, lack of churches. And they said they needed more information from the Department of Agriculture, which astonished the Department of Agriculture because they had been putting out brochures for farmers and for farm wives on a wide variety of subjects for many years. But either they had not been getting to the people who needed to see them, or the people didn't think there were enough of them. And one of the results of that was that in 1920, they hired Florence E. Ward, who was the head of the extension work in agriculture section of the Department of Agriculture to try and find out, again, what women's needs were. And they surveyed 10,000 women, and they generally reported that they liked country life, but they wanted conveniences. They complained about the fact that they were still using kerosene lamps, stoves for heat, fetching water, etc., when there were technological things to replace all of those. Ward's comment was that the average farmer's barn is better equipped technology than the farmer's house. She also made a really interesting point. She said, are the women who live on farms, are they farmers, or are they just housewives doing chores, and the chores happen to be related to farm work? And she said, well, here's one way to look at it. You get to make your own decision. 1/3 of the farms in the United States sell, and this was 1920, sell butter. 30% of the women who live on those farms help milk. 88% of them wash milk pails. 60% of them make butter. 29% of them keep the records. 33% of them sell butter. And 11% of those women have butter money. In other words, get some of the money from the selling farms. So she says, are these housewives doing chores, or are these women farmers? You get to decide. Jumping right along to 1980, Department of Agriculture hired a non-government agency, the National Opinion Research Center, to do a survey of women living on farms. And they found out that 60% of women who lived on farms grew up on a farm or a ranch. 31% of them had jobs off of the farms. 66% of the farms where there were livestock, the women were involved in animal care. 90% of the women were married. 60% of those women felt that they could run the farm without their husbands. But only 8% of them listed themselves on tax forms as farmers or ranchers or farm wives. It's worth pointing out that there were tax advantages for the women not being listed as farmers or ranchers. But they explained that only men can be farmers, and they themselves are not like men. These were the women who were surveyed saying this. And that's everything I'm going to tell you about women as farmers. But I have another chapter to discuss. And we're going to go to women and the law. And we're going to discuss the chapter of women as criminals. This woman went to prison for, in Kansas, I believe, for robbing a post office. Unfortunately, I don't know her name. The first report we have on criminal statistics from the US government was 1850, the Census of Population. Had a section on moral and social condition. And it had statistics about prisoners. Specifically, there were 4,600 white men in prison, 115 white women, 801 colored men, including slaves, in prison, 87 colored women, including slaves, in prison. And, excuse me one second. My wife just got home, and so I'm shutting the door. Moving right along to 1880, Mr. Frederick Howard Wines wrote a report for the Department of Interior. The Census Office was in the Interior Department then, on the defective, dependent, and delinquent classes in the United States. That would be people we would call mentally ill, mentally retarded, or developmentally disabled, and prisoners, and so on. And he reported, he listed every crime for which women were in prison in 1880. I couldn't fit them all on this page, but most of them are there. The ones that appear in red, only women were in prison for. And let's just go through here. If you have any questions about the definitions of any of these crimes, I may be able to help you afterwards, or I may not. But let's just let them all roll out. Again, women were in prison in 1880 for all these crimes. So, as I said, I couldn't fit them all in, but that's most of them. Mr. Wines, who wrote that report, also made a speech which was published, in which he said some things which I'm sure he didn't feel he could put in the government report, but it's worth pointing out. The men outnumber the women in prison nearly 12-1. This is partly because women are better than men, and partly because they are more timorous and less aggressive. If a wicked woman wants a crime committed, it is easy for her to get a man to do it for her. Partly, too, the smaller proportion of women who are prisoners is due to the leniency of the officers of the law in dealing with them. Most of the offenses committed by women are not of a serious character. Mr. Wines also said, think of 168 women in prison, all of whom are over 60 years of age, and 3 of them over 80. It may be proper to hold them where they have no home and no friends as an act of humanity, but an imprisonment must have wrought its full effect upon them, and in them they cannot be, in view of their infirmity of body and mind, any longer a menace to the security of society. And one would think that they might be allowed to close their eyes upon the scenes of earth outside of prison walls. Being over the age of 60, I resent the idea that I am no longer a menace to society, but let it go. 1910. Something interesting in the Census of Population occupational statistics. They explain persons reported on the population schedules, in other words, recorded by the census takers, as engaging in disreputable callings are not credited as having gainful occupations. Ordinarily, a professional thief or gambler or keeper of a house of ill fame, that is, a brothel keeper, would make a false return, telling the census taker that he's a night watchman, a speculator, or a boarding house keeper. Such persons were then classified according to the occupation they claimed. But in the rare cases when the person told the truth, they left it out entirely. So, for example, if a person said, yes, I keep a brothel, they would not be recorded as having any occupation at all. And they explain that this is not because they were embarrassed to put it in the figures, but because the figure would be untruthfully low, since most people would not put that in accurately. However, this is from the handwritten figures that a census taker did, and you'll notice that there's the person's name and how they were living, the fact they were renting a room, and in the right-hand column it says prostitute. So this was apparently a brothel that he had discovered. Whether they each explained that they were, each of these women explained that they were prostitutes, or whether the person wrote it down on his own, we don't know. However, they did not get listed that way in the published reports. Have to explain about this. Probably 15 years ago, a woman came up to me and she said, I need to find all the information I can about one woman who lived in Whatcom County, which is our county, in 1900. And so I sent her to the census microfilms and showed her how to use them. And she came back to me and said, what's a demi-monde? Well, I knew, but when a librarian gets a question like that, he is supposed to check a dictionary, and we did. And of course, a demi-monde is a prostitute. She was thrilled. She had found an entire house of demi-mondes here in Bellingham. And so she was able to pick one of them and use them as the person she would write about. So I made her very happy. I told this to a librarian friend of mine, and she said, yes, in Seattle, they called them seamstresses. So that's how they were recorded in the census there. 1911. There was great concern from Congress about women and children working outside the home. Just to be clear, that's women working outside the home and children working outside the home, not the children of women working outside the home. And they were concerned with how this was affecting them in all different kinds of ways. And they wanted to do a major survey and a series of reports on it. And there was actually argument about whether Congress authorizing such a thing was even constitutional. The people who were most concerned about that were the Southern congressmen, because they knew that most children who worked were working on farms or in textile mills, cotton mills in the South, and they figured it would be a hit job on them. But it did go forward. They wound up with 19 reports, all of which you can find on the internet. And the one that interests us is Mary Connington. I wish I could find a picture of her. I even contacted her alma mater, which was Amherst College. They can't find a picture of her either. But she wrote a book called How to Help, which was for many years the standard textbook on on charity and social work. But she was also hired by the government to write one of these 19 reports. The whole series was called Report on Condition of Woman and Child Wage Earners in the United States. And volume 15 by Mary Connington was Relation Between Occupation and Criminality of Women. There was a feeling going around in the United States that working outside the homes, especially in those crazy newfangled factories and department stores, led women to lives of crime. And so she was trying to study that question. Spoiler alert, she found out that it was not true. By the way, the report is short and very easy to read. I highly recommend it. One of the questions she tried to find out was, were most women prisoners former factory workers, which is the theory that people were going on. And they found out it was generally not being asked. She said even in communities where more enlightened attitude has been taken and where the state requires them to find out what prisoners were doing before they went to jail, this law is frequently nullified by the indifference of the officials. What's the use of asking these women what their occupation is, said one warden in a state where the law required that. They won't tell the truth about it anyway, so I just put it down as housework. Maybe some of them do other things, but then others don't do anything at all, so it probably averages up all right. And a related question, did work in department stores lead women to lives of crime? Well, she talked to a person who she said would know the answers to this. She didn't say who he was. And he explained that he had once interviewed the owner of a millinery business, women's clothing business. And the man explained that in order to get prostitutes as customers, he had hired a manager who herself led an immoral life, meaning had been or was a prostitute herself, because she would be able to talk easily with the prostitutes and they would be happy to come there. And the man who was interviewing the owner said, well, didn't you find such a forewoman had a bad effect on your other employees? In other words, having an immoral woman running the department, wouldn't that lead to them getting into bad habits? And the owner replied, sometimes, but as soon as I found out they were going that way, I discharged them. So in other words, if he found out that their behavior was no better than that of their boss, he fired them. Another problem Connington found was different definitions of crimes. So in one locality, if a woman is convicted of keeping a disorderly house, it may mean only that there's a lot of loud talking and singing and quarreling that bothers the neighbors. In another location, it invariably means she maintains a house of ill fame, a brothel. A charge of vagrancy brought against a woman in one place means that she's a tramp. We would call her a homeless person. In another, it indicates that she's living by illicit means, in other words, a prostitute, but the police lack evidence to convict her of the specific offense, so they convict her of vagrancy. 1942, Uniform Crime Reports, which are published for many years by the FBI. The alarming upswing in crime among women and girls points to the need for renewed efforts to keep the home front clean, wholesome, and strong. An obvious suggestion is that more women are committing crimes because the men were off fighting in the war. And so, I don't know, I guess more crimes needed to be committed by somebody else. In 1997, the National Institute of Justice published a report on women in jail. And they were concerned because the number of women prisoners had tripled in the last 10 years. So for a long time, women in prison had just been considered a sort of appendix that didn't need to be worried about. They say, now we actually have to look at it. They found out that it was usually nonviolent crimes. Most of the women had children. Most of them had legal custody of their children. And they recommended that women's prisons become, I misspelled the word, models for men's prisons. My apologies. Okay, I just added that yesterday. So, that is all I'm going to say. I am delighted to answer questions for you. And The Fort Worth Library, as Gabby said, has copies of the book which you can borrow. But if you would like to buy a copy of the book, my publisher has very generously provided a 20% coupon. And if you email me at that address, I will email you a copy of the coupon so you can get the book at a savings. And now I am happy to answer questions for you.
Okay, I think let me start the video so I can be seen. Okay, I'm going to start the question period, but I did see that Ruth had a question. So after I go, I'll let Ruth go next. So I was just curious, as you were doing the research for this book, did you feel like, was it the government, like the federal government, that was curious and driving the sort of research questions for a statistical collection, or was it sort of outside forces like women's groups, or was it just sort of happening together?
Most of the time it was the government who was interested, but there were definitely women organizations involved. I warned Gabby and Linda before I started, I wrote this book 5 years ago. I can do a presentation fine, but when it comes to questions, I'm going, because I didn't rehearse them all. But when they put out figures of women occupations, I think in the 1900 census, the newly organized National Association for the Advancement of Women said, you guys are all screwed up, and asked them to change it. And they also pointed out that women were not allowed to be census takers, which they felt was biasing the figures as well. So sometimes there were, a lot of it was coming from the government. A lot of them were coming from businesses that wanted information about possible customers. And also there were women organizations that wanted information as well. In one of the early chapters of the book, I have a list of some of the questions that the Census Bureau rejected. And they include everything from, are you a virgin, to do you own a piano? So there are always people who wanted the census to ask questions on different subjects.
Thank you.
Okay, so the question from Ruth is, as a current historical researcher of Texas medical history, I have often seen women physicians and dentists listed as housewives in population censuses, especially before 1940. Do you know of any U.S. Census Bureau instructions that might have produced this underrepresentation of women physicians? FYI, Ruth says that she was a U.S. Census Bureau employee for the 1980, I got to get my mouse up here where I can scroll down, 1980 population count, and then hired to collect data for U.S. Public Health Service survey for health statistics.
Yeah, even in the 1930s, 1940s, especially 1930s, they were aware that it was a problem. They would point out that the classic example is a census taker knocks on the door, and the woman opens the door, and she has 3 kids, and she's got food cooking on the stove, and she's got a broom in her hand, and he asks the census questions. He's supposed to ask whether she has a job. Is he going to bother to ask whether she has a job, or is he going to assume that she doesn't? So a lot of the time they completely miscalculated the number of women who were working, and that would certainly be true. Unless the woman volunteered the information, they might not find out. I'll give you one of the elevator pitch I use for this book is the following. In 1940, the census recorded over 1,000 women working for the railroads as engineers, conductors, and mechanics. And in the published report, those 1,000 plus women were counted as tailors because the government didn't believe they could have really been doing those jobs. So sometimes it was because the census takers were not told the right questions to ask. Sometimes sometimes women did not choose to list that they had a job because they thought that that was an embarrassing thing. This was 1900. This was pointed out, and sometimes it was because the census simply didn't believe it and tended to erase people. Whether they did that with doctors and dentists, I don't know. Let me tell you a favorite story of mine. in terms of gainful employment, the term that was used, whether a woman was gainfully employed or not. Dr. Smith is a man. He has a secretary who essentially runs his business. Miss Jones, he pays her $10 a week. She is gainfully employed. They get married. She keeps doing the same work. She is no longer gainfully employed. So.
Okay, and I actually have a question of my own. Do you think that World War II, and I suppose to a lesser degree World War I, had an impact on the mismeasurement of women with the census regarding their occupations? You know, because women went to work doing jobs that were typically traditionally done by men at a much greater volume. And if there was an impact, do you think that it lasted?
Yeah, there certainly was an impact. By the time the 1940 census, the figures I gave you about women working for the railroad, they honestly knew that those figures were wrong, and they said that, but they figured that they couldn't change it without changing all the old figures or having this huge leap. So they kept it artificially lowered. And this had a very bizarre effect in World War II because when the war started and women started going to factories, the reporters looked at the figures and said, wow, there's this huge increase. It wasn't actually that as huge as we think it was because they had been lying about how many people were doing it before. But between 1930 and 1950, the way they calculated women working and the workforce in general changed dramatically. It had actually more to do with the Great Depression than World War II, because it's not worth explaining. But the way they had tracked whether a person was working or not no longer fit with the Great Depression, and so they actually had to change that. So by 1940, they had made changes. But yeah, I have chapters in there about women working in factories and other work in World War I and World War II. I think in World War I, it was very dramatic. They were surprised at how many jobs women could do. And I have a chapter on occupations suitable for women, which was a book published when World War II started. And they said, I believe that they estimated that approximately 25% of jobs in the United States could be adjusted so that women could do them. So interesting. Yes.
Very much. So do we have any other questions? If you do have a question, you can type it into the Q&A or the chat down at the bottom of your screen. So I think it sounds like that is it. I'm not seeing anybody typing. So we thank you very much for your presentation. It was very informative and kind of raises some additional questions and interesting things to look back into. I love that you brought up the yellow wallpaper. It's a favorite of mine, and I think that that and some of the other things you talked about, some of these reports that I've provided a link to the report on the condition of woman and child wage earners in the United States in the chat. So if you want to click through and see that, I mean, not you, Robert, but you're well aware of where it is.
I'm sick of
it. All right, Gabby.
Yeah, sorry. I was just thinking, what's that old line? There are lies, dirty lies, and statistics. And and I mean, it really made me, I've always known that statistics they're not really mutable, but they're squishy sometimes. And so your book really made me think a lot more about like how these questions were asked, who they were asked of. And so in a sort of bigger picture, doing any kind of historical research, it just really kind of opened my mind about how to go about asking questions and doing historic research. And it was great. I really enjoyed it.
It's easy to fall into a trap here. Agatha Christie put it once beautifully, and I can't find the exact phrasing she used, but she said, "Never assume evil when stupidity will explain the same circumstances." And it's very easy to say, "Oh, these people were trying to hide information about women." Mostly, they just hadn't thought it through, if you follow me.
Yeah, that was my sense too, like how incredibly hard it was to both overcome assumptions that they might have had and just figure out how to ask the right questions to get answers that they were looking for.
Yeah.
Well, and you were talking about statistics, and statistics are only as good as the data they're compiled from. And a lot of times with researchers here in the library, they seem to kind of feel like if it's in the census, then it's absolute, it's fact, it's in stone, and it's accurate. But that's really not the case, because you had people that were, asking somebody the questions, and they may not be able to clearly understand that person. I mean, honestly, you don't know how good of hearing the person that's the enumerator has. And then they're trying to guess at how it's spelled. And maybe the person is spelling it and then they write it down wrong. There's just so much that can go wrong. And so you really have to take everything in the census with a grain of salt.
Yeah, and census are just about the best social statistics we have in the United States, but they ain't perfect. I was saying to Gabby and Linda beforehand that Robert Heinlein, the famous science fiction writer, wrote Stranger in a Strange Land and Starship Troopers. When the 1940 census came out, 72 years afterwards, and you could actually see what people wrote down, either he or his wife or the census taker, everything in there except the name Heinlein is a lie. So there you go.
All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, all of you who listened. Thanks for the great questions.